Welcome to the Lord of the Rings Lorecast, the show that explores the background of Tolkien's amazing world from the very beginning. You would expect that after doing this for a long time now, that I wouldn't be so surprised by some of the things that I notice when reading through one of Tolkien's books or stories. But here I am again, surprised, or at least uncovering things and understanding them in a deeper way, and I'm happy to communicate that with you as well. Now, speaking about communicating things, have you ever been in a situation where you knew a lot about something because it was for your job or a hobby, or it was something that you really loved, and somebody asked you a question about it? And so you started explaining it in detail, and after about 30 seconds, their eyes started to glaze over. Then you realize that you've committed the cardinal sin of over-explaining things, or at least explaining it to a detailed level that they were not expecting and ready to digest in the moment. And this isn't your fault. It's not their fault. This is a very natural human reaction to having to digest and consume a large amount of information all at one time. Our brains find that taxing, and sometimes we find it not necessarily the thing that we really wanted to think about at the time, or whatever. Now, when you are a novelist or a content creator, this is something I've learned as well. If you're going to convey information, you need to wrap it up in something more entertaining, something that, a little bit of sugar makes the medicine go down, that sort of thing. And I think this is something that Tolkien definitely understood. In fact, I think this is something that many people have understood for a very long time. And it works great for content creation as well. If I simply give you a list of facts, then you would very quickly turn off the show. But if I present it in an engaging manner, telling you a story and adding bits of humor and details that are genuinely enjoyable and entertaining to you, then you're going to consume that information much more easily. And Tolkien is doing exactly that. Now, there's a fine line you have to balance, especially when writing a novel, because people think of novels as entertainment, not as information. Imagine if Tolkien had started telling the story of Middle-earth in the Third Age and the events that happened to Bilbo and Frodo and Gandalf and everybody else, and it read like a history book. In fact, that's one of the things that makes people hesitant to dive into the Silmarillion, is that there are parts of that story that read like a history book because they were written like a history book. And if you present people with a history book, then their eyes glaze over and they think back to grade school, and that feels like homework. Now, think about the opposite of this. If you were to convey a story that was only entertaining, that never gave any information, never divulged anything, any meaning, anything beyond just being entertaining in the moment, now you've created a soap opera or just kind of garbage content that is enjoyable and also extremely forgettable. What Tolkien does in his stories, and especially in The Fellowship of the Ring, because he has become exceedingly good at it by this point, is he merges a depth of information and an entertaining and compelling story in order to pull us through that. And he balances it on the edge of a knife. One of the things that people note all the time is the depth of detail in every one of his novels. And in the section that we're going to go through, it is full of detail. We find out little important things that I'm sure Tolkien thought was important for us to know as the reader, like what month it was, some of the meticulous details about setting up the big party for Bilbo. These and other details would be very boring to just read in like a history book. But notice as we go through this section, how Tolkien drops us little details, little questions, little things that we wonder about, and even uses the details, the actual information, in order to make us more interested in the story. It talks about Gandalf's rune. What is Gandalf's rune? Why does he have a rune? That seems peculiar. Who are these dwarves that keep showing up and helping Bilbo with the party details? And what is the surprise that Bilbo is going to have at the party? He balances sharing information and making it fun and enjoyable in a way that compels us to not bounce off that information, but to be even more compelled by it and interested and curious about what is going to happen and what else we can know about it. In fact, he does it so well that you and I and everyone else listening to this show are here in order to find out more about this world and those exact details. It's amazing. He's a master at this craft, and I'm going to point it out more as we go. So get ready as we continue our extreme close reading of The Fellowship of the Ring. So like I noted in the intro, he starts off with just information in the paragraph that we're beginning with this week. That very month was September. And for those of you who have been fans for a while and celebrate Bilbo and Frodo's birthday on September 22nd every year, and I know different places will do different things and celebrate in different ways online and also in real places like in Hobbiton in New Zealand. Well, this is one of those points where he talks about a very specific detail. Why would we need to know that it was September? Why would we need to know what the air felt like and how it was a nice day out? It's because it's important. It sets the scene. And it contrasts later in the book with other places that they go and other changes to the weather and the environment around them and all of that. It allows us to establish that this is not just a beautiful rural type farming community, but it is a place where in September, the weather is crisp and beautiful. And it's something we can all relate to. It's another detail that pulls us into the story from the perspective of Bilbo. And in this paragraph, we find out that there will be fireworks and that Sam is the one who has spread that information around, probably not because he shouldn't have, but because he was the first to find out the detail and was excited to share it. And of course, as we saw in the previous episode, rumors travel across the Shire. But we also get a fun little detail about the fireworks. Fireworks had not been seen in the Shire for nigh on a century, not indeed since the Old Took died. Now, who is the Old Took and why is that important? Well, the Old Took is Bilbo's grandfather. And Bilbo's grandfather was on the Took side of the family, not the Baggins side of the family. And as we've discussed many times in The Hobbit, that is the more adventurous side of Bilbo's ancestry. The Old Took lived to 130 years old and is the third longest living Hobbit-type person after Bilbo and Smeagol, who also had long life due to the ring. So the Old Took is actually the only one that we know of who lived an extended life of 130 years naturally. And of course, there was a big celebration and all of that, but we also know more about the Old Took, and it doesn't say it here in this section, but we do know that the Old Took was friends with Gandalf. In fact, Gandalf had given him diamond-studded earrings that would attach or unattach magically to his ears. Now, that might seem like an odd gift, and I think it definitely seems like an odd gift if you actually think about it a little while, but I believe that there's a reason for that. First of all, it shows how close the Old Took and Gandalf were, that they would give each other presents back and forth. Secondly, the Old Took had a magical item, a piece of jewelry. Bilbo has a magical ring. The Old Took had magical earrings. So he lived a long life. He was of the Took bloodline, which he had many, many children. In fact, the most children in the Shire until later on when Sam settles down and has many, many children. His actual name was Gerontius, which is Latin for old man. And on top of it, we know that Tolkien wanted Bilbo to have very old grandparents because he himself had very old grandparents that lived to 100. So we're getting this relationship between Bilbo and Gerontius Took, and it's mirroring both each other. We're seeing that Bilbo is kind of a direct offshoot from Gerontius Took. He is a little bit odd. He's adventurous. He makes friends with wizards and elves and dwarves. But in some ways, it also confirms that Bilbo is a little bit of a stand-in for Tolkien himself. He wants to have things in common with this character, like having old grandparents, like living in a place that feels very much like the English countryside. There are similarities here, and they're not unintentional. The other thing worth noting is that there were fireworks at the Old Took's celebration a century ago, and Gandalf provided them. And if Gandalf provided them a century ago, and he looks like an old man today, then how old is Gandalf? And so it raises questions for the reader. Of course, we know the answer. He's a Maiar. He's basically ageless, but he is an old man too. He looks like an old man, and he does slowly age. So he would have looked slightly younger a century before, but not by much. And the final thing here, and I know there's been a lot for just one paragraph, but the use of fireworks for the old Took's birthday celebration 100 years ago, and it being that long since we saw fireworks, helps us to understand how truly special that was and why everyone would be so excited for it. It's something that doesn't happen, but maybe once or twice in any Hobbit's lifetime. So I hope that was entertaining enough and informative at the same time that kept you going. But call back to the beginning. All right, now we're on to the second paragraph of the section we're going through today. Man, we're taking our time. Days passed and the day in all capitals drew near, well, capital T, capital D, signifying that this was, a very important event. An odd-looking wagon laden with odd-looking packages rolled into Habe-Tun. This is another one of those moments early on in this book where Tolkien adds a little dash in the middle of a word. Hobbiton is one word, but it's not just one word. Like many Anglo-Saxon words, it is a combination word of two separate words that come together to describe a brand new thing. And I think Tolkien is trying to draw our attention to the fact that this is Hobbiton. The Hobbit part is important here. It is a town of hobbits. It is not a town of men. It is not a town of dwarves, wizards, anything else, elves. And so therefore, anything other than a hobbit traveling through these parts is going to stand out. And it does exactly that. The startled hobbits peer out of their lamplit doors to gape at this cart that clearly comes from somewhere else. It's a little mysterious because the doors are lamplit, so this cart is driving into Hobbiton probably in the evening or at night, and it's full of people who aren't hobbits. Dwarves with long beards and deep hoods. And some of them stay after the delivery. They stay with Bilbo at Bag End. Bilbo has extra bedrooms in his hobbit hole, and he keeps these people as guests who will be there to continue working on setting up the party. But it's mysterious to the other hobbits in the town. This seems odd. But to us, it's not mysterious because we know that Bilbo was friends with dwarves. In fact, the whole reason he left previously, decades ago, was because he went on an adventure with a bunch of dwarves who just showed up out of nowhere and knocked on his door. So you might be naturally asking the question, who are these dwarves? Are these some of the party that he went on the adventure to the Lonely Mountain with? Well, no, they're not named. And chances are these aren't those same dwarves all the way from Erebor coming across the wilds in order to get back to the Shire and to Hobbiton. No, these dwarves are from the Blue Mountains, not in the east, but in the west, because that's where Thorin's folk went when they lost the Lonely Mountain. And the Blue Mountains were historically a place where the dwarves had lived since the first age of the world. Now, there's a long history there, and those same dwarves aren't necessarily the same ones who are there. It's a mix of dwarves from the Longbeards and maybe some other clans who now live in a community of homes out on the ground, not deep underground. There might still be some underground. There's still mining and things going on, but they also do have homes above the ground and are part of this greater community. And I'm going to get more into the details on this in the bonus episode this week. The Shire as an actual place with little towns and cities and things like that connected, and the fact that it was actually part of the kingdom of Arnor at one point. So you're welcome to come join me on the Patreon if you would like the bonus episodes. And there's almost 200 bonus episodes, so there's lots of extra content out there. But in short, hobbits and dwarves lived within a relatively close distance from each other, and the dwarves were good craftsmen. They were good at building things, and so it makes sense that Bilbo, having connections with the dwarves, would be able to hire some of them in order to come set up this big celebration full of tents and all sorts of decorations and other things. So to Bilbo, this felt normal, but to the rest of the town, this felt very odd. And then, in broad daylight, we get an old man driving all alone, another wagon, and he's described like this. He wore a tall pointed blue hat, a long gray cloak, and a silver scarf. This is exactly the same description we get of Gandalf in The Hobbit. So if you are somebody who's read The Hobbit, you would know exactly who this is immediately. He had a long white beard and bushy eyebrows that stuck out beyond the brim of his hat, which the more I read that makes me wonder if the brim was smaller and his eyebrows were able to peek out above it, or if his eyebrows were massive and it has a relatively large brim like we normally see. But maybe peek out is not fully extend beyond the brim. It may not be exactly the same thing. And of course, there's a reaction, and we get the reaction that we see in the film with the Hobbit children running after the cart. And of course, in the book, Gandalf doesn't light off a firework in order to get them to cheer or anything, but that's basically the scene. Then he gets to the front door, he begins to unload, and we find out that the fireworks that he's pulling off this cart come in all different sorts of shapes, but they're also labeled with a red G and an elf rune. Now, this is an audio podcast, so it's a little bit hard to describe this, but think of the letter I with two extending branches, almost like a tree, coming out to the right side and up to the top of the letter shape. You've probably seen this before. It's in the movies. It is traditionally Gandalf's rune. Now, Gandalf didn't invent this rune. This rune was actually part of a rune set designed by the elves and eventually co-opted by the dwarves and was used in their language and marking things and all sorts of other stuff. And Gandalf reads runes many different times throughout these stories. This was one of them. And they're called Cirth runes, Cirth. I believe it's a hard C in the pronunciation, but again, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that and it's Cirth, but I'm pretty sure it's Cirth. And this is not the only place that this rune is ever seen. In fact, it is very similar to the Old Norse rune that means the letter F. Old Norse runes are also known as Elder Futhark, and I'm probably mispronouncing that as well, Futhark. Tolkien would draw inspiration for many of these old languages and old stories and things like that, of course, and it makes sense that he would pull a Norse rune as a symbol for Gandalf, even though it's an F instead of a G, from the Old Norse runes, because even the name Gandalf comes from Old Norse. It means staff elf, which doesn't take too much creativity to think about it a little bit and realize that that could be symbolic of a wizard, even though he looks like a man. And then we get his name. The next paragraph says that, of course, that's Gandalf's mark, and the old man was Gandalf the Wizard. Right out the gate, he is a wizard. We know, all caps, capital G, capital W, and that he was famous in the Shire for skill with fires, smokes, and lights. And there's a reason for this. Magic in Tolkien's universe doesn't work the same way that we would think about it today, because everything we think about magic has been changed by Dungeons and Dragons and video games and all sorts of things. We think about throwing a fireball and just making things exist out of nowhere. The magic in The Lord of the Rings is more like bending reality to your will in some very specific way. And if that synergizes with what nature can actually do on its own, it becomes even more powerful. Now, there is a mystical element to it. There are definitely things that cannot be explained, and some people just seem to be more magically inclined than others, like elves or even dwarves at times. But wizards aren't the kinds of people who just toss fireballs. In fact, we talk about this a bit. There's a whole episode I do about magic in Middle-earth. But then even in The Hobbit, when Gandalf is lighting pine cones to throw at the wargs below the trees, he's not casting fireballs out of nothing. He's simply heating up the pine cones until they catch fire. And there's a reason why he can do this. It might have something to do with being a Maiar and simply having some control and power over nature naturally, but that's not really Gandalf's domain until he received one of the rings of power. When Gandalf landed on the shores of Middle-earth millennia ago, he was gifted the Ring of Fire, Narya, by Círdan the Shipwright, who was the original owner of that ring, and probably the oldest living elf in Middle-earth still. With the use of the ring, he had more control over things like fire and smoke and lights, which makes sense when you know the details, but is still kind of mysterious because there's no detail here about Gandalf having a magic ring or anything other than simply being a wizard and having abilities to control fire, smoke, and lights, or at least make them. It's probably a combination of both. His real business was far more difficult and dangerous, but the Shire folk knew nothing about it. Tolkien is doing that thing in the story where he's been giving us details and information, but he is also planting these seeds of curiosity to make us go, okay, what else is his job? He's not just a traveling wizard that sets up, pretty light shows. Okay, there must be something going on. Now, if you've, of course, read The Hobbit, there definitely is a lot more going on to Gandalf. But if you're new to this book, it draws us in. And on top of it, if you think about it, if you did read The Hobbit, you would still have questions about his real business in the world. What is his actual intent? What is actually going on? And why, if he has such difficult and dangerous and important business other places, would he be back in the Shire for a birthday party? So the Hobbit children are excited and they shout G for grand, which might be one of those things that the Rings of Power latched onto if you've been watching that series, that in their I'll call it their canon because it's a version, let's say, of Lord of the Rings lore. Gandalf gets his name, and hopefully this isn't a spoiler, in case anybody wants to know, just spoiler, just skip ahead like 10 seconds. He gets his name by one of the proto-hobbits calling him a grand elf. That becomes Gandalf, which was a little cringy, let's be honest, but I get where that might come from. So the little hobbits get all excited, and it says here, they knew him by sight, though he only appeared in Hobbiton occasionally and never stopped long. This implies that Gandalf comes by every decade or so, that maybe some of these younger hobbits, and remember, hobbit childhood lasts like a decade longer than our childhood does. And so he must have been around enough for them to recognize who he was. But why would he be traveling through Hobbiton every decade or so and all of these other places? And that leans directly into Gandalf's role. The wizards were sent to Middle-earth in order to combat Sauron and the spreading of darkness. And the way that each wizard went about that was different because they were each inclined in different ways. Gandalf is the social wizard. It's weird to say it that way, but his job was to get to know all the peoples of Middle-earth and to try to connect them together, to try to bridge the cultural gaps and the histories and anything that would have gotten in the way, because Gandalf knew that the only way to combat Sauron would be as a unified front, not as a divided people. And that may sound just kind of obvious, but there is historical precedent for this. The elves of the First Age lose until the very end, where they're bailed out by the Valar, the powers from across the ocean that come and help out. But they basically lose the fight with Morgoth, the original Dark Lord, because they're divided due to their own actions. And it seems like Gandalf and the other Maiar and the Valar who send them over here understand that. It's time for that spring reset. I'm taking a look at everything in my closet and figuring out that, oh no, this absolutely needs to go. And it's about time I replace things so that my clothes aren't older than my 15-year-old. Now you might think that they lasted that long because they were well made, but no, they're in terrible condition. Unlike the new jeans I just got from Quince. Jeans have always been my personal go-to because you can kind of wear them for lots of different things, but maybe they're not your thing. Maybe you're looking for, 100% European linen with insanely soft flow knit activewear fabric. It's definitely getting warmer, and their flow knit activewear is moisture wicking, anti-odor, and soft enough that you'll actually want to wear it every day. So pick out what you want. You can't go wrong because they have prices 50 to 60% less than similar brands. And like I said before, they are high quality. I continue to wear their clothes all the time, and I know that these new jeans are going to last me a lot better than the other things in my wardrobe. And on top of it, they look great. They're so comfortable. And I spent just as much on the jeans that I am now cleaning out of my wardrobe. So if you're looking for something better, just all around better, go check out Quince. So go do it right now. Refresh your wardrobe with Quince. Go to quince.com/ringslore for free shipping and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too. Go to quince.com/ringslore for free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/ringslore. And so the new tactic in the Third Age to combat this new dark threat is not strength of arms, it's cooperation. So Gandalf finishes unpacking, Bilbo helps out, some dwarves help out, and we're told that Bilbo gives away a few pennies, which would have been, today that feels like, oh, he gave away just a few cents, why would you do that? But no, back in, of course, Tolkien's day, that would have been worth more money, and it shows that Bilbo is being generous. We just heard in the previous section of the story how he was not miserly. He would be generous with his wealth, and he was doing that. But we're also told that not a single squib or cracker was forthcoming, meaning that they didn't even light any of the small fireworks just for fun and entertainment of the little hobbits nearby. So in this way, it does contradict one of the things that happens in the films, but it's a minor detail. And I guess you could say in the films it's Gandalf that lights off a firework while he's still in the cart, rather than Bilbo, who would have done it after unloading the stuff. So it is kind of different. So Gandalf says to the little hobbits, hey, it's time to go. We've got other stuff to do. You're going to get plenty of fireworks when the time is right. Don't worry about it. And then we finally get a conversation between Bilbo and Gandalf. They go inside of Bag End, and the afternoon was bright and peaceful. The garden looking out west. And anytime west is mentioned, it might be a reference to Valinor, the home of the Valar and the Maiar, the angelic-like beings that watch over Middle-earth. And I think there's reason to think that that's intentional here, because it also pairs in this paragraph with talking about the red and golden flowers, snapdragons and sunflowers, and how his dwelling was in synergy with nature. His garden is beautiful. The window looks to the west. These are all subconscious signs of Bilbo being a good person and being in line with the will of the Valar. And in fact, Gandalf points this out. He says, how bright your garden looks. Bilbo responds, yes, I am very fond indeed of it, and of all the dear old Shire. Which corresponds with what we know about him from The Hobbit. He very much does love the place he lives, even though some people treat him like he's an oddity. But then he says, I think I need a holiday. Contrast. Again, Tolkien is telling us this story and making us go, wait, what? This is something that happens in story. You'll notice this all the time now when you watch movies or TV shows especially, is the scene where, oh, there's one thing absolutely in one direction and then it's the complete opposite. Somebody says, hey, I need you to do this thing. And they go, no, there's never in a million years a way I'm going to do that. And then in the very next scene, they're like, okay, I'm convinced I'll do it. It's that sort of thing. Maybe not to that extreme, but we get this sense of like, Bilbo is very happy here, but he's not. It's a flip. And so Gandalf says, you mean to go on with your plan then? Again, mysteriously alluding to something that's pulling us through the story. I do. I made up my mind months ago and I haven't changed it. Very well. It is no good saying any more. Stick to your plan, your whole plan, mind, and I hope it will turn out for the best for you and for all of us. So Gandalf, it seems to be quietly reassuring Bilbo without pushing him too hard, but that means that Gandalf is on board with this, and it's probably a good idea. Then Bilbo says, I hope so. Anyway, I mean to enjoy myself on Thursday and have my little joke. And this is the part that Gandalf isn't so keen about. Who will laugh, I wonder, said Gandalf, shaking his head. We shall see, said Bilbo. So even when Bilbo is in line with Gandalf and the will of the Valar and all of that, he still is Bilbo. And this gives that feeling of like a child and a parent. We know Bilbo is very old at this point, but Gandalf is much older. He's always the parent in the room who's trying to corral all the children to go in the right direction. And he's hoping this doesn't create too much of a problem, but ultimately, he is not going to control people. He will simply advise. And so the next day goes on and more of this happens. More orders start coming in for all sorts of things. Bilbo is prepping for the party. Basically, he has the entire Shire who is all invited to the party. And so therefore, everybody in the Shire who cooks food or does other things that would prepare for this event. And they're all busy. In fact, the postman is extremely busy. And it's noted here that the Hobbiton post office was blocked and the Bywater post office was snowed under and voluntary assistant postmen were called for. Now, snowed under here, I don't think that means actual snow. In fact, the weather's been very nice so far. It means that it was inundated with letters, people writing and responding, invitations going out and responses coming back in. It also means that the Shire has a post office. This is not something that I think a lot of people point out. It's one of those seemingly anachronistic points. This feels like an ancient world, and yet the people who live in the Shire, the hobbits there, have post offices and other functions of what feels like relatively modern conveniences. How does this make sense? Well, it shows that the hobbits were actually fairly sophisticated, and even though they didn't live in a kingdom like Gondor or Rohan, that they had conveniences that made their lives very comfortable. And some of these conveniences would have spread out further to places like where the dwarves lived near the Blue Mountains. You can imagine somebody sending a letter from Hobbiton to the dwarves in order to coordinate this party. In fact, that seems very likely. I don't think Bilbo actually went on an adventure to go over there. They probably just send letters. And as we know from The Hobbit, this part of the world is relatively untouched by the dangers of the wild, which means that places like Bree and Hobbiton and Mickle Delving, the capital of the Shire, and the places where the dwarves lived, and even some of the places nearby where elves still dwelt, may have been interconnected in ways. The remnants of the kingdom of Arnor are still here, even though Arnor isn't really a functioning kingdom anymore. In fact, the Shire, after it was settled by the hobbits, was officially incorporated into the kingdom of Arnor centuries ago. So it makes sense that some of that infrastructure would actually be maintained. Then we're told details about the days up to the party and how there was a sign on the gate that said, "No admittance," another little dash there, "admit-tense," except on party business. And Bilbo was busy with preparations and writing to everybody. And then one day, the big tents go up and everybody can feel that the party is just over the horizon. It's coming very soon. In fact, it says, the 3 hobbit families of Bagshot Row adjoining the field were intensely interested and generally envied. Old Gaffer Gamgee stopped even pretending to work in his garden. And I love that it implies that for a while there, he had just been pretending because he was so interested and distracted by the events that were going on with the party preparation. Now, you might be wondering, who are the 3 families that live on Bagshot Row? Well, of course, there's the Bagginses, Bilbo and Frodo. There's the Gamgees, so the old Gaffer and Sam. But then there's also Daddy Twofoot, who lives here as well, who we met just a few pages earlier, who was having a conversation with the old Gaffer at the inn. And the decorations seem awesome. They've got lanterns hanging on trees, and even more importantly, and it says here, for the hobbits, more promising still to the hobbits' mind, an enormous open-air kitchen was erected in the north corner of the field. And now notice, again, all these little details, but the details matter. They're part of what make this world feel real. And we know, if we read The Hobbit, that food is very important to hobbits because they eat multiple meals throughout the day, way more than we do. And in fact, food was so important that Bilbo pulls cooks from every inn and eat house from miles around in order to supplement the dwarves and other odd folk that were quartered at Bag End. So there's 2 things here. First of all, it doesn't say every inn and restaurant. It says every inn and eat house. And there's a reason for that. I had to look this up. But it turns out that the word restaurant didn't enter the English lexicon, that's a fun word, until like the 1800s. Before that, what we would consider today a restaurant was called an eating house. And that comes from the 1400s. So the Shire might have post offices, but it doesn't have restaurants, which puts it in a very specific, I guess, evolution of society norms, styles, structures, however you want to say that. And so Tolkien has done a wonderful job here about just giving us all of these details and information that makes it feel like a real place with real things happening, with real reactions, the way that people would react in these situations, but also seeding these questions and these curiosities about what is going to happen at this party. What is Bilbo's surprise? Who is Gandalf really? What is going on with him traveling to and from different places? And why is he a wizard? What does that even mean? So many details, and yet so many questions that pull us through this narrative. And then this section ends with this. Then the weather clouded over. That was on Wednesday, the eve of the party. Anxiety was tense. Then Thursday, September the 22nd, actually dawned. The sun got up, the clouds vanished, flags were unfurled, and the fun began. Thanks for tuning in again. I hope you enjoyed that episode. And as I mentioned earlier, I will be delving deeper into the details of the Shire. What is actually going on here? How is it even laid out? Is it a county? Does that make sense? Why is there a mayor? where do the different parts of the Shire relate to each other? We're going to get into that in the bonus episode this week, which you can, of course, enjoy if you sign up on the Patreon, patreon.com/LOTR Lorecast. You can get ad-free episodes and, of course, all the bonus episodes. And it's honestly almost 200 episodes for a very minimal amount of money. So if you're burning through the content and you want to check it out, then go check it out. Join us over there and help support the show. Thank you. I couldn't do this without all of you. And welcome to all of our wonderful new patrons. We've had so many people sign up in the last week. Lawrence J, Nathan, Hampus B, Patrick G, Fiona O, Josh A, Enna, I think, or Enna S, Kat O, Cyril P, and Das S. Thank you so much for signing up and being a part of this. And I have to shout out all of our VIP patrons. So let's see if I can get through this without messing anyone up. Fulcrum, David S, Daniel Nightweaver, Capenna, Richard J, TJT, AK Music Lover, Barney D, Azel Razzle, Lori B, Mason Weathertop, Jezer, Gimli a Break, Divine Madman, Rosie Rose, Ginger Fury, Who On Is My Hero, Eldarian Was Right, Avariel, Party Snacks, Single Ent Looking for Entwives, Malt, I'm just going to call you Malt from now on, Norwegius, Balragius Hunterus, Bruce W, Artemis, Kira C, and Das S. Thank you so much for your support. Also, of course, you can help out sharing the show with your friends and family. I have a feeling a lot of you have been doing that because the numbers have increased. I think a lot of people are excited to finally get to The Lord of the Rings, and so that's awesome as well. And you can leave a review or comment wherever you're listening. If you do leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, which you don't have to listen on there. Of course, you could just have an Apple account and log in and leave a review. Those get disseminated across the internet. So those are extremely helpful, and I'll read it out on a future episode of the show. So thank you all for your help. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and I'm going to go do the bonus episode. I'll see some of you over there. Stay safe out there, and if a wizard and a bunch of dwarves ride in through town on a wagon, well, you're in for a treat. Go check out that party. I have a feeling the surprise will be worth it. Thanks for listening to the Lord of the Rings Lorecast. If you'd like to learn more about other fantasy worlds, check out my other podcasts, The Elder Scrolls Lorecast, The Witcher Lorecast, and more at robotsradio.net. If you'd like to reach out, I'd love to hear from you. Send me a note on Twitter at robots_radio, or join our amazing community on the Robots Radio Discord. There are links in the show notes, or just search Robots Radio Discord, or find the link on robotsradio.net. I'll see you next time.
It's cozy season, and nothing compares to wrapping yourself in a Minky Couture blanket. Luxuriously soft, perfectly warm, thoughtfully made. From movie nights to chilly mornings, Minky Couture turns everyday moments into pure comfort. Once you feel it, you'll understand why it's called the original best blanket ever. Visit minkycouture.com or a store near you and make this cozy season your softest one yet.
This episode sponsored by Ridwell. Ever tossed something into your recycling bin and just hoped it would get recycled? That's wish cycling, and most of the time, those items don't actually get recycled. Ridwell makes it simple to get it right. Ridwell helps you recycle the things your curbside bin doesn't take, like plastic bags, snack wrappers, pill bottles, and bottle caps. Getting started is easy. Just order a starter kit, fill the bags, send them back for free, and Ridwell takes care of the rest. Start today at ridwell.com.